Today I wanted to look at an article I came across on BuzzFeed that I thought was quite an interesting topic, and that is 17 culture shocks that Canadians have experienced in Canada, province to province. So on my channel I've looked at experiences people have had, culture shocks that people have experienced moving from other countries like the UK to Canada, but I never really considered that actually people within Canada, Canadians might actually experience culture shocks just going to other parts of Canada, because obviously Canada is such a huge country, every province is so unique. I guess there's things that are unique to each province that maybe someone from another province wouldn't have experienced before, whether it's food, just something in day-to-day life. So I'm going to look at this. If you're from Canada, tell me if you've ever experienced culture shock just going to another province in Canada. Tell me if there's anything interesting. I don't need to put this on actually. Tell me if there's anything interesting about any other province that you didn't expect. So let's check this out. Number one, I've been to both Newfoundland and Ireland, and it's shocking how there's not a lot of difference between them. Accent, culture, right by the sea, it's all quite similar. Though I will say that Newfoundland is a heck of a lot closer, so if you want the Irish experience, you don't need to go far. Now, I just made a reaction to Newfoundland English, the language, the dialect of Newfoundland people. I mentioned there's a lot of similarities in that to Ireland and also Scotland and Wales, other parts of Britain. But here it mentions also, culture right by the sea. Of course, that makes sense, having the immigrants come from Ireland and that part of the world over to the east of Canada, settling there, so there would be bound to be a lot of that culture there. Tell me if you've been to Newfoundland, if you're from Canada, if you see that yourself. Tell me if you've been to Ireland and you can compare them, how they actually compare. But yeah, I guess if you're going from another part of Canada, that would be quite a shock. Number two, in British Columbia, a flashing green light means a pedestrian controlled light. In other words, that light won't turn red until a pedestrian pushes the button to cross the road. Basically, oncoming traffic is still oncoming. So yeah, I guess, is that something that is unique to British Columbia? Do other provinces have that as well? Here in Malaysia, in the UK, I guess there's like a mixture of different types of pedestrian crossings. Some you'll press and it'll change the light. Some will just change on a timer and things like that. Tell me what it's like in your province. Tell me if you've experienced that in British Columbia. Number three, I was shocked to learn that completely over-the-top Canadian TV Canadian accent actually does exist in some places when you leave the West Coast. So I'm not too sure what they mean by that. Again, if you're from Canada, you'll probably know what an over-the-top TV Canadian accent is, and if that is something that's not just on the, or like that's not in the West Coast but in other parts. I guess when people say things like or a boot, a lot of people say that the majority of people don't actually say things like that or don't speak like that. But I guess maybe in some places in Canada, people do speak like that. Tell me if what you think about that one. Number four, I notice Albertans will turn left from the travelled lane instead of the centre turning lane like in Ontario. I can only assume centre turn lanes are not a thing there. So again, I am not too sure about that. I don't really know much about Canadian roads or the roads of Alberta or Ontario. Tell me if you notice any differences in the way you drive just between provinces. Is there any differences in the laws between those places, whether it's on the road or just in general general law? Number five, in Ontario and Quebec, you'll be driving around a residential area where there is the road, then a ditch, then someone's house pretty close to the road. In Alberta, residential areas always have a curb. Okay, so here they don't have a curb in Ontario and Quebec. Then a ditch. So you don't have curbs in Ontario and Quebec. If you're in a rural area where there is a ditch, the house would be further back too. I have always found the mix of rural and residential infrastructure in Ontario and Quebec to feel very alien. So again, someone coming from Alberta to Ontario or Quebec and finding it very alien just because of the way the road is structured, again, that seems to be a big culture shock for a lot of people. So number 6, the fact that in Saskatchewan and Alberta you can drive for kilometres without seeing a house. In rural Ontario, at least along Lake Ontario, you never really leave town. Wow, that's interesting as well. So yeah, I guess in Alberta and Saskatchewan it's more desolate. I actually like the sound of driving kilometres without seeing the house. It sounds like it would be nice and peaceful to drive, nice and relaxing. But rural Ontario, you never really leave town. So is it just built up the whole way along the lake? I guess that would be interesting in itself, actually. Number 7, I was surprised that Nova Scotia has amazing beaches. I wouldn't be surprised myself, because actually being from Scotland, we actually have beautiful beaches as well. And not a lot of people actually think of it. So even though the weather is not so good in a place like Nova Scotia compared to like tropical islands and things in Scotland also, we have those beaches. It just means like for the majority of the year maybe we can't go out, be sunbathing, having beach bars and that sort of thing, but there is a lot of beautiful beaches in Scotland. It's nice to hear Nova Scotia has amazing beaches as well. Where has the best beaches in Canada? Is it Nova Scotia? Have you been to a Nova Scotia beach? How is it? Number 8, donairs in the east coast are not like donairs in the west. The latter is more like a Turkish doner and has different vegetables and a decent amount of doner meat on them. Maritime doners are 2 pounds of doner meat with cubed tomatoes and onions with a sweet sauce on them. Shook me the first time I saw them. Now, I didn't actually know. I know obviously a doner kebab. We get them in the UK, I love them, but I didn't know there was a different thing called a doner until I watched Beard Meats Food. This guy who he goes to different places eating a lot of food, and then recently he went to Canada and I seen that doner is something slightly different to a normal, like I guess it's a Turkish doner kebab, which is the one I'm more used to. So tell me what a doner on the east coast is like and how it differs. 9, West Coast doesn't have bag milk, which is super popular in Ontario and the other eastern provinces. So of course I've learned about bag milk on previous videos about something being quite unique to Canada, and it says on the videos that usually it says they're popular, but from the comments reading it, people told me it's not so common and not so popular. But I guess maybe in the West Coast it's not, but maybe it's just certain provinces, in this case Ontario, bagged milk is popular. Number 10, I'm from Quebec and I went out west and suddenly people were saying hey instead of eh. Took me a while to realise I wasn't being yelled at. Also, it's much more difficult to find fresh cheese curds out west. So I guess poutine is not as popular or common on the west. Is that true? But tell me about the quirk of language there. Do people more say hey on the west rather than eh? Number 11, the biggest culture shock is honestly housing and how people allocate their money and their debt. I have friends who live rural in 1,000 square foot houses they bought for $30,000 in their 20s. They spend their extra money on power sports, trucks, hunting, vacations. Have other friends who are in their mid-30s entering the housing market in major cities, making way more money, taking no vacations, having none of the expensive toys or hobbies, deferring having children and paying mortgages on places they bought for over $1 million. Isn't that interesting? That's just the real comparison between rural life, city life, and that is a huge disparity actually. I didn't realise it was so stark, the disparity. Tell me if you've lived in the more rural place, would it be worth it to move somewhere rural if you have all these nice things, nice house, can save money, have all these vacations, or do you prefer living in the city but not having that money to save and spend on nice things? Number 12, I was pleasantly surprised to discover there's a vibrant French community in Winnipeg. Okay, tell me more about that. I guess it makes sense having a French community in Canada as a whole, in Quebec, and I guess that would probably spread to other places as well. So Winnipeg is one of those places. Number 13, I grew up in an incredibly white area of the country and moving to Toronto was an adjustment. Toronto is very racially diverse in a way that the rest of the country isn't. So what about British Columbia? Is that not racially diverse? Is there anywhere else that compares? But I guess it's similar to the UK. London is very racially diverse, but when you go to the other towns and cities, probably majority white, I would say. Similar. 14, I was shocked by the trash sorting. In BC, it's perfectly normal to have 4+ bins in places like schools or shopping malls. You have one for paper, compost, paper, cardboard, one for cans and bottles. I was confused when I was at a mall in Ontario and saw only 2 bins. I didn't know where to put my pop can. So I guess, yeah, I mean, it's just how different places do their recycling. Here in Malaysia, generally you have 3 bins, paper, plastic and glass, I think. And actually maybe 4 for 1 for general waste as well. But good to see like BC got some good, got it implemented for recycling. But I guess, yeah, it doesn't make too much of a difference. Number 15, my first time out west in Calgary, coming from the GTA. Where is GTA? All I could think of was how clean the streets were. Interesting. So yeah, tell me, where's the cleanest place in Canada, the cleanest province, cleanest city? Is there anywhere that's known for that? Number 16, as an Alberta to Ontario transplant, it was a shock to see how there were still somehow phone booths everywhere here when my home city got rid of them at least a decade ago. So do people still use phone booths? I think in the UK we got rid of most of them. Some of them you'll still see in London, the red ones, but that's more for like tourist attractions. But yeah, I never knew places still had them. Number 17, last one, flying from Alberta to Ontario, you're going from one of the driest regions in North America to one of the most humid. It's a dramatic shock to the senses. That's the size of Canada, I guess. Like you're getting a whole host of climates and different geographies. So interesting that people in Canada get these culture shocks just within Canada. Tell me if you recognise any of them. Tell me if there's anything on there that, any other culture shocks you've experienced in other provinces that are not on that list. But yeah, interesting. Tell me if there's any other topics you want me to learn about. Thanks.